The ancient world holds secrets, some buried beneath forgotten stones, others whispered across the pages of scripture, veiled in mystery and wonder. Among those shadows walks the story of giants, of beings taller, stronger, feared, their presence echoing through the oldest verses of the Bible like distant thunder rolling across the hills of time. Who were they? The Nephilim, the fallen ones, the mighty men of old. Their footprints stretch from the dawn of humanity to the edges of faith and myth alike. But their story is quiet now, hidden, fragmented, a puzzle of ancient words and sacred warnings. Tonight, we trace their footsteps, gently, through the landscapes of Genesis and beyond. Together, we'll wander the forgotten hills of Canaan, the flood-soaked plains, and the battlefields of old, where giants once walked beside men and legends bled into scripture. But first, as we settle into this story, I wonder, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Is it morning, evening? Perhaps the quiet hours of midnight when mystery feels closest? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing where this small corner of reflection reaches. Now, let us drift back through time to the first whispers of the Nephilim and the giants who walked the earth. The earth was young then, wild and untamed, its valleys carved by rivers older than memory, its mountains pressing jagged crowns against the sky. The sun rose over ancient fields, casting its light upon forests thick with life, upon plains untouched by the footprints of kings or empires. It was a world still whispering with the breath of its creator, a world before time gathered itself into kingdoms, before history etched its name in stone. But even in that early dawn, shadows moved across the earth, shadows not easily explained or forgotten. Scripture speaks of them with quiet reverence, laced with warning, veiled in mystery. In those first chapters of Genesis, tucked between the stories of creation and the coming flood, a few simple, haunting lines emerge. Lines that ripple across millennia, igniting questions, stirring wonder, fueling stories whispered through generations. The Nephilim, they were there, giants, the mighty men of old. But their presence is fleeting, their names tangled in both sacred text and ancient myth. They arrive not with grand introductions, but with a quiet unease, spoken of briefly, yet heavy with meaning, their story pressed into the soil of a world teetering toward judgment. It begins in Genesis, chapter 6. The words drift softly from the scrolls, layered with both wonder and dread. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives, any they chose. The verse curls upon itself, its meaning shadowed by time, debated by scholars, whispered among the faithful. Sons of God, daughters of men, a union forbidden, unnatural, unsettling, and from that union, the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the giants. Their name lingers in ancient Hebrew with a gravity that defies easy translation. Nephilim, those who have fallen, those who cause others to fall. Beings of might and mystery, straddling the fragile boundary between heaven and earth. Some say they were the offspring of divine beings and human women, a mingling of the celestial and the mortal, a breach of the natural order that rippled across creation. Others argue their origins lie elsewhere. Warriors of renown, descendants of ancient lines, their size and strength woven through legend rather than bloodlines divine. But the scripture does not elaborate. It lets the silence stretch, the details fade, leaving only fragments and questions. What is certain is their presence. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Giants walked among men, their stature towering, their strength unmatched, their names etched into stories of old. Their existence carried with it an unease, a crack in the foundation of humanity's early history. It is no accident that their brief mention precedes the flood, the great deluge that swept across the earth, silencing civilizations, rewriting the landscape, cleansing what had become corrupted. The world in those days was unraveling. Violence blossomed across the land. Wickedness took root in human hearts. And somewhere beneath it all, the Nephilim walked, their shadows stretching long upon the earth. Mary of Magdala once carried the weight of unseen chains, her story marked by affliction and restoration. But here, with the Nephilim, we find a different kind of shadow, one ancient, enigmatic, tangled in the fabric of the early world. These giants, these mighty ones, arrived not with redemption, but with questions, with fear, with whispers of a world cracking beneath the strain of its rebellion. And as the Creator looked upon the earth, heavy with violence, steeped in corruption, a decision was made. The flood would come, the waters would rise, and the giants, their fate, like their origins, would blur into mystery, into half-remembered stories carried on the wind. But their legacy, the ripples of their existence, would not be so easily washed away. Even after the ark settled upon Ararat, even after the earth dried and life renewed itself, stories of giants lingered. The Nephilim, their name was not yet forgotten. And so, as the world emerged from the flood shadow, so too did the ancient tales of giants, taller than men, fierce in battle, etched into the edges of scripture like warnings carved into stone. Their story was not over. The Nephilim, the giants of the Bible, their footprints would stretch far beyond the days of Noah, into the hills of Canaan, onto battlefields where shepherds stood against warriors, into the quiet verses of prophecy yet to unfold. And so we wander onward, tracing the echoes of giants through the sacred text, seeking not only their size, but their meaning, their message, their place within the vast unfolding story of creation itself. The waters of the flood receded slowly, their echoes still humming beneath the soil as the earth stretched once more beneath open sky. The ark had come to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, its wooden beams weathered by rain and storm, its occupants emerging into a world reborn, yet still shadowed by memory. Noah, his family, the creatures of every kind, they stepped carefully onto the drying ground, their eyes wide with both awe and uncertainty, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what had been lost. The great deluge had swept away cities, fields, forests. Entire generations washed into the deep, their legacies drowned beneath the weight of judgment. And yet, beneath the silence that followed, the story of the giants remained. Scripture offers only fragments, whispers trailing through the verses like mist curling along the edges of forgotten hills. But those fragments speak with quiet authority. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Afterward, a single word that bends the boundaries of time, that stitches together the world before the flood and the world emerging in its wake. The giants had not been entirely silenced. Their shadows lingered still. Mary of Magdala's story was one of healing, of affliction lifted beneath the hand of compassion. But the tale of the Nephilim, of giants, unfolds differently, wrapped not in redemption, but in the quiet, unsettling realization that not all shadows yield so easily to the light. As Noah's descendants scattered across the earth, as tribes rose and languages drifted into countless tongues, stories began to surface once more. Stories of giants walking among men, of warriors whose stature towered, whose strength defied reason. The ancient lands of Canaan, rich with hills and valleys, carried whispers of these beings, tribes whose names bled into the stones themselves. The Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, each spoke of giants, of those whose presence unsettled the heart, whose sighs loomed like monuments to a forgotten time. The scriptures are quiet, but deliberate. In Numbers, when the spies sent by Moses returned from the promised land, their words trembled with both awe and dread. "We saw the Nephilim there," they reported, their voices laced with fear. "The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Grasshoppers, small, fragile, insignificant beside those towering figures. The land that flowed with milk and honey also carried the weight of giants, their presence woven into the soil, their legends rooted deep beneath the olive trees and ancient stones. Yet the people of Israel had wandered through wilderness, carried by the promises of the God who split seas, who rained manna from heaven, who carved commandments into tablets of stone. They had seen wonders, but still, the giants unsettled them. Fear can grow taller than truth when shadows stretch long across the hills. The Nephilim, or those believed to descend from them, stood as both literal and symbolic barriers to faith, a reminder that the promised land was not easily won, that the journey from wilderness to fulfillment was carved through trial, through uncertainty, through towering opposition. But their presence was more than myth, more than metaphor. The scriptures do not dismiss them as legend. Instead, their footprints press through the pages, steady, unsettling, yet undeniably real. In Deuteronomy, in Joshua, in Samuel, the echoes continue. The Rephaim in Bashan, King Og with his iron bed measuring nearly 14 feet long, the Anakim rooted in the hills of Hebron, the shadow of Goliath looming over the valley of Elah. These giants, whether remnants of the Nephilim or born from the same whispered lineage, stood as monuments to an ancient defiance, their size both physical and symbolic, their presence a challenge to the unfolding story of redemption. And yet, they too would fall. For though the giants walked tall, the God of Israel stood taller still. As Mary had learned, freedom from darkness was not born of human might, but of divine compassion. So too, the giants would not be overcome by strength alone, but by faith wielded by shepherds, by courage rooted in promise. The Nephilim, the giants, their story lingers, layered with mystery, veiled in ancient soil and sacred text. But their presence is not merely for fear. It is a reminder. The battles we face, the shadows that loom, the impossible height before us, they are not the end of the story. The giants may walk, but so too does the hand of God, steady, unwavering, shaping the course of history beneath their towering shadows. And so, we follow the echoes deeper still, tracing the steps of giants, wandering further into the hills of Canaan, into the heart of ancient battlefields where myth and scripture collide, and the quiet questions of the Nephilim remain. The hills of Canaan rose like ancient sentinels carved by time, their rocky faces worn smooth by the whisper of wind and the steady tread of countless footsteps across the soil of promise. The land stretched wide, a patchwork of fertile valleys and fortified cities, olive groves clinging to the hillsides, vineyards pressing their roots into the earth. But beneath the quiet hum of life, the ground carried older stories, veiled in stone and shadow. It was here, among these hills, that giants once walked, the descendants of Anak, the Rephaim, the Emim, their names etched into the memory of the land like ghostly echoes of a forgotten war. The Israelites, weary from their wilderness wandering, stood upon the threshold of this ancient land, their hearts heavy with both hope and dread. Moses had led them through parted seas, through barren deserts, through the fire of Sinai. But now, as they gazed upon the hills of Canaan, it was not the fruitfulness of the land that filled their minds. It was the towering figures who dwelled within its borders. Giants. Their reputation stretched beyond mere legend. In numbers, the spies sent ahead returned with trembling voices, their reports layered with awe and quiet fear. The land flows with milk and honey, they admitted, their hands full of fruit so large it required 2 men to carry a single cluster of grapes. But their wonder unraveled beneath their next words. The people who live there are powerful. The cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anakim there. The shadows of the giants pressed heavily upon their courage. They saw themselves small, grasshoppers beneath the towering figures who guarded the land. Fear wove through the camp like a slow, creeping fog. Mary of Magdala had once known that same fog, when the affliction bound her mind, when the unseen chains coiled around her soul, when freedom felt distant, impossible. But freedom, as she discovered, does not bow to shadows, nor does faith yield to giants. Among the 12 spies, 2 voices rose with quiet defiance, Caleb and Joshua. Their eyes, though filled with the same visions, carried a different certainty. We should go up and take possession of the land, Caleb declared, his voice steady, layered with belief that stretched beyond what the eyes could measure. But the others recoiled, their fear swelling like a storm. They saw only giants. They saw only defeat. And so the people hesitated. Their disbelief rippled outward, their refusal to trust twisting their path, delaying their entry into the promised inheritance. The giants of Canaan, whether of Nephilim descent or the towering Anakim, became more than physical opponents. They became symbols of fear magnified, of faith tested, of the boundaries between belief and surrender. For generations, their presence lingered in the collective memory of Israel. Stories of giants shaped the edges of courage, their shadows haunting the hills, their downfall woven through the unfolding narrative of a people called to trust beyond their sight. The Nephilim, those first giants whispered of in Genesis, may have been shrouded by floodwaters, their lineage blurred by time, but their echoes lived on, in the Anakim of Hebron, in the Rephaim of Bashan, in the fear that gripped the hearts of those standing on the edge of promise. But as with Mary's own story, the giants did not write the final chapter. Faith would rise. A new generation led by Joshua would enter the land. The fortified cities would fall. The giants would face not armies of equal stature, but the quiet, relentless authority of the God who had split seas, who had spoken stars into being, who had walked with his people through wilderness and uncertainty alike. The giants of Canaan stood tall, but the hand of heaven loomed larger still. And so, as the Israelites pressed into the land promised to them, the giants trembled. For though their size towered over men, no height could rise beyond the reach of the one who commanded both earth and sky. Their story, like the Nephilim before them, would fracture, their shadows fading into the ancient soil, their legends whispered through the stones. But for now, we followed their footsteps deeper still, into valleys where battles brewed, into the fields where giants would fall, into the heart of Scripture where faith faces the impossible. The land of Canaan stretched before them, rich with promise, heavy with the memory of giants. The hills rolled like the backs of sleeping beasts, the fortified cities looming upon their peaks, stone walls etched against the skyline, defiant, unmoving. Among those hills, the descendants of Anak remained, giants in both stature and reputation. Their lineage whispered like an old warning across campfires and temple courts alike. But the people of Israel, weary from years beneath desert suns, carried more than fear now. They carried a covenant, etched upon stone tablets, pressed into their hearts through trial and wandering, shaped by the voice of the God who had led them through wilderness and flame. Joshua led them forward, his step steady, his eyes set upon the land promised to their ancestors, his spirit braced for what lay ahead. The giants, though formidable, would not halt the unfolding of history. Mary of Magdala had once known what it meant to stand small before towering shadows. Her affliction vast, her freedom distant, her heart bound beneath the weight of what seemed impossible. But impossibility unraveled in the presence of the divine. So too, in Canaan, the giants would falter beneath the quiet authority of faith. The battles came swiftly. The city of Jericho, its walls high and impenetrable, fell not by sword, but by obedience, the people marching, the trumpet sounding, the hand of heaven collapsing stone upon stone. The giants of the land watched as Israel advanced, not with overwhelming armies, but with courage rooted in promise. Yet the Anakim remained, a looming defiance upon the hills of Hebron, their stature unmatched, their reputation steeped in ancient legend. They were said to descend from the Nephilim, the mighty ones of old, the giants whispered of before the floodwaters silenced the early world. Whether by blood or by myth, their presence clung to the hills like fog upon morning fields. Caleb, now aged but unyielding, stood upon those hills, his eyes sharp, his spirit unwavering. "Give me this mountain," he declared to Joshua, pointing toward Hebron, toward the stronghold of the giants, toward the shadows that had once filled the spies with dread. At 85 years old, his courage burned fierce, his faith untarnished by time. Mary had clung to that same fire, the quiet defiance that refuses to yield to darkness, the steady belief that shadows break before the rising sun. Caleb's footsteps pressed into the ancient soil of Hebron, his sword steady, his heart anchored to the God who had promised victory beyond what the eyes could measure. The giants stood tall, their limbs broad, their presence towering, but size could not shield them from what was coming. The scriptures speak with quiet finality. The land was taken, the Anakim driven out, their shadows fractured beneath the advancing tide of faith. The giants fell. The hills of Hebron, once echoing with fear, now carried the footsteps of those who believed, of those who walked not by sight, but by trust in a story greater than themselves. Yet the memory of the Nephilim, of the giants, of the mighty ones of old, lingered still. Their presence, though diminished, rippled outward across the generations, their echoes found in battlefields yet to be fought, their names woven into the stories of shepherds and kings to come. The giants of the Bible were not merely obstacles. They were the testing ground for belief, the towering reminders that faith is forged not in ease, but in the face of the impossible. And so we wander onward, tracing the final echoes of the Nephilim, of the giants, of those whose shadows once stretched across the ancient hills, seeking not only their downfall, but the greater story rising beyond them, a story of faith, of courage, of a God whose authority towers beyond giants, beyond myth, beyond fear itself. The valley of Elah lay quiet now. The dust settled, the armies scattered, the body of Goliath crumpled beneath the weight of his fall. His name would linger upon the tongues of generations, not as a symbol of might, but as a monument to the unraveling of fear. But beyond the battlefield, beyond the whispered tales of a shepherd's courage, the echoes of giants continue to hum beneath the surface of Scripture, their presence not easily erased by the turning of pages or the passing of kings. The Nephilim, the fallen ones. Their story remained, a quiet, unsettling thread, stitched through the ancient world, tangled in both faith and myth, pressed beneath layers of dust and time. For even as Israel pressed forward, as kingdoms rose and temples stood etched against the skyline, the question of giants persisted. Goliath was not the only remnant of old. The scriptures speak of his brothers, giants dwelling in Gath and its surrounding regions, their stature broad, their presence steeped in the same defiance that once echoed through the hills of Canaan. The Rephaim, their name meaning the dead or the shades, whispered through the borders of Bashan and beyond, their legends lingering in the shadows of ancient strongholds. King Og of Bashan, his bed of iron measuring nearly 14 feet, stood as a quiet testament to the giants who once roamed the earth, their size etched not merely in myth, but in the very stones of history. Mary of Magdala had once carried shadows within her, a mind tormented, a soul shackled by unseen chains. But even the deepest affliction yields beneath the gentle authority of divine love. So too, the giants, however vast, however storied, faltered when met with the quiet, steady unfolding of heaven's plan. Yet beyond the known, beyond the measured heights and the recorded battles, deeper questions linger. Who were they truly, these Nephilim? Were they the offspring of divine rebellion? Fallen beings trespassing upon mortal soil, their union with the daughters of men a breach that fractured the foundation of creation? Were they ancient warriors, their might exaggerated across generations, their legacy tangled in both reverence and fear? The scriptures leave space for wonder, for mystery, for the unsettled edges of understanding. The book of Genesis offers only fragments, the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim upon the earth in those days, and also afterward. And afterward, the word stretches across time like a shadow upon the hills, its edges blurred, its meaning layered with both caution and awe. Some scholars peer into the ancient languages, the hidden nuances of Hebrew, the distant echoes of cultures now buried beneath the sands of time, seeking answers in forgotten myths and sacred texts alike. Others point to the apocryphal writings, the Book of Enoch, with its elaborate tales of watchers descending from heaven, of forbidden knowledge, of a world teetering beneath the weight of corruption and pride. There, the Nephilim rise again, their presence expanding beyond the brief lines of Genesis, their story painted with broader, darker strokes, a tale of angels fallen, of human frailty intertwined with celestial rebellion. Yet the canon of Scripture remains measured, deliberate, its silence upon certain details perhaps as purposeful as the words it preserves. The giants walk the edges of the biblical narrative, present, undeniable, yet veiled in mystery, their legacy a quiet hum beneath the grander story of redemption. Mary's journey reminds us that not all battles are fought with swords, that the deepest giants are often those unseen pressing against the walls of the soul. But freedom always comes. The giants may stand tall, their shadows stretching wide, their stories echoing through the hills, but the hand of heaven towers taller still. As we trace the footsteps of the Nephilim, of the mighty ones of old, we find not only remnants of fear, but the steady unraveling of every towering obstacle before the quiet, relentless march of faith. And yet, the echoes of giants are not confined to the ancient hills of Canaan or the fields of Bashan. Their presence hums beyond the pages of scripture, whispered through cultures, through mythologies, through the distant, unsettled corners of human history. Their story is not yet entirely silent, and so we follow the echoes further still, wandering beyond the boundaries of the familiar into the deeper mystery of giants and the sacred questions they leave behind. The ancient world is woven with stories, the kind that drift across generations, their edges blurred, their truths tangled in the quiet spaces between history and myth. Across cultures, across distant lands, echoes of giants stretch beyond the borders of Israel, beyond the valleys of Canaan, their presence stitched into the fabric of human memory like the faintest shadow upon the earth. Mary of Magdala had learned that shadows cling long after their source fades, but so too does truth, quietly unfolding, steady as the dawn. The Nephilim, the giants of scripture, may have walked the hills of ancient Canaan, their legacy rooted in the soil of the Promised Land, but their echoes ripple further still, into the forgotten corners of old civilizations, into the half-whispered legends carved upon stone and clay. In the myths of Mesopotamia, towering figures rise, the Apkallu, part divine, part human, their knowledge vast, their presence unsettling, their stories laced with both reverence and warning. In Egypt, the great builders stand immortalized in stone. The pyramids, the temples, monuments that whisper of knowledge and strength beyond comprehension, their origins still debated beneath desert suns. Across the distant isles of Greece, the Titans loom, primordial beings, vast in both stature and power, their defiance of the gods etched into the bones of myth, their downfall a cautionary tale laced with awe. Even among the Norse, the Jötnar, the frost giants, stride through their sagas, embodiments of chaos and strength, forever at odds with the divine order. These tales, though wrapped in the unique colors of their cultures, carry a shared thread, the memory of beings larger than life, of strength untamed, of shadows cast long upon the early world. Some see these legends as mere echoes of human imagination, a way to explain the vastness of creation, the unexplainable remnants of ancient structures, the forgotten bones unearthed from the soil. Others peer deeper, tracing the fragile line between scripture and story, between what was written and what remains half remembered, half lost to time. The Nephilim of Genesis, the mighty men of renown, the giants whose presence preceded the flood, may stand alone within the sacred text, but their ripples reach beyond, tangled in the myths of distant peoples, in the fractured memories of civilizations now buried beneath dust and ruin. It is here, in the overlapping spaces between faith and legend, that the story of giants stretches beyond its borders, inviting questions too vast to fully answer, inviting wonder too sacred to dismiss. Mary's own story reminds us that the unseen carries weight, that not all battles are visible, that sometimes what lingers in the quiet corners of our lives shapes the greatest transformations. So too with the giants. Their legacy may be fragmented, their presence veiled, but their story shapes the backdrop of human history, their echoes unsettling, inviting reflection, caution, humility. The giants, whether born of divine rebellion or human exaggeration, stand as reminders of pride reaching too far, of boundaries blurred, of a world straining beneath the weight of its own defiance. And yet, they also point us toward the greater truth that rises beyond them, a truth carved not in size or strength, but in faith, in redemption, in the quiet authority of a creator who writes the final word upon the pages of time. The Nephilim, the giants, the mighty ones of old, their footprints stretch beyond Canaan, beyond Bashan, beyond the valley floors of Israel. Their presence hums beneath the surface of ancient stone, beneath the whispered myths of empires lost to history. But so too does the steady, unyielding hum of the sacred story, the story of a world redeemed, of shadows silenced, of giants fallen beneath the hand of heaven. And as we wander deeper still, we follow their echoes, not to glorify their size, but to understand their place, and the greater light that rises beyond their towering forms. The bones of the earth carry stories, stories buried beneath layers of soil and stone, pressed deep into the forgotten crevices of time. Archaeologists brush carefully across ancient ruins, their tools scraping against relics long abandoned, their hands sifting through the fractured remnants of civilizations lost to memory. In the quiet places of the world, where weathered stones lean upon one another, where monoliths rise beneath overgrown vines, where the skeletons of forgotten cities stretch along distant plains, there lingers the faintest hum, the question of giants, the Nephilim of Genesis, the Anakim of Canaan, the Rephaim who haunted the hills of Bashan. Their stories may be wrapped in the sacred pages of Scripture, but their echoes bleed outward, tangled in the ruins that ripple across the earth, in the whispered legends that follow those who seek the ancient places. Stone walls taller than men, arranged with precision beyond the tools of their time. Monolithic pillars weighing hundreds of tons, their surfaces carved with symbols whose meanings strain against understanding. Megalithic cities rising upon remote mountains, their construction defying the known skill of the people who walked those hills. Some point to these remnants as the fingerprints of forgotten knowledge, as whispers of giants, beings whose strength shaped stone, whose presence towered beyond what history has dared to record. Others dismiss them as the ingenuity of ancient hands, their mysteries explained not by giants, but by the quiet, relentless persistence of human ambition and craftsmanship. But even among scholars, the question remains, pressed beneath the dust. The world holds puzzles too vast, too fragmented, too unsettling to dismiss entirely. Mary of Magdala understood the weight of the unseen, the affliction that once bound her mind, the whispers others could not hear, the shadows that clung long after the world declared them impossible. Yet the impossible unraveled in her presence, the healer's hand upon her, the storm within her silenced, the chains fractured beneath love fierce enough to confront even what the world denied. So too with the giants, the Nephilim, the mighty ones of old. Their legacy stretches beyond the boundaries of easy explanation, inviting the same quiet defiance that refuses to surrender mystery to dismissal. Across the distant corners of the earth, the legends continue. In the highlands of Peru, the towering ruins of Sacsayhuaman press into the Andes, their stones so vast and tightly fitted that even blades cannot slide between them. In the sands of Egypt, beneath the shadow of the pyramids, questions persist. The size, the scale, the engineering etched into limestone and granite, their origins tangled in both skill and speculation. In the Pacific, upon Easter Island, the Moai statues stand, their features weathered, their mass immense, their purpose shrouded in both culture and myth. Are these the relics of giants, their craftsmanship, their monuments? The scriptures do not tie the Nephilim to these ruins, do not stretch their story across oceans or continents, but the human heart, ever drawn to wonder, stitches together the fragments, seeking threads of meaning within the scattered stones. The giants, whether born of ancient rebellion or human imagination, become more than beings of stature. They become the embodiment of questions, the quiet yearning to understand what lingers beneath the surface of history, What truths strain against the fragile boundaries of what we believe we know? Mary's story reminds us that transformation often begins in the places of unrest, in the shadows of uncertainty, in the tension between what is seen and what is quietly unfolding beyond it. The giants of Scripture, the Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, their legacy invites that same tension, that same sacred curiosity. Across the bones of the earth, the questions remain, etched in stone, buried beneath ancient soil, whispered across the ruins of forgotten places. Their presence unsettles, invites wonder, calls us to look deeper, to walk softly among the old places, to trace the footprints of giants with reverence and caution alike. And as we wander further still, beyond the hills of Canaan, beyond the ruins of ancient worlds, we follow the echoes of the giants, seeking not only their presence, but the greater truth that rises beyond their shadows. The ancient texts speak softly, their words woven with mystery, their meanings layered beneath centuries of translation, interpretation, and quiet reverence. Among those words tucked into the folds of Scripture, the story of the Nephilim hums like a faint, unsettling echo. Never fully explained, never entirely silenced, but beyond the canon, beyond the recognized books of the Bible, other writings linger. Apocryphal texts, ancient scrolls, fragments of stories preserved by scribes whose hands trembled with both faith and curiosity. It is within those pages that the story of the giants stretches further still, tangled with the strange and the sacred alike. The Book of Enoch, a text preserved by tradition but excluded from the official canon, unfolds its chapters like ancient whispers carried across desert winds. There, the Nephilim rise again, not merely as giants of great stature, but as the product of a celestial defiance that fractured the boundary between heaven and earth. Enoch speaks of the Watchers, angels who descended upon Mount Hermon, drawn not by obedience, but by desire, by rebellion, by the pull of human beauty and the longing for power beyond what was theirs to hold. They took wives from among the daughters of men, their union birthing the Nephilim, beings vast in size, fierce in strength, corrupted by both celestial origin and earthly defiance. Their presence, the text declares, filled the earth with violence, with the unrelenting hunger of giants who devoured the labor of men, who turned upon one another, their strength unraveling into chaos and bloodshed. The flood, in this telling, becomes not merely a judgment upon human wickedness, but a cleansing of the unnatural, the silencing of the giants whose presence fractured creation itself. Mary of Magdala knew what it meant to live fractured, to carry within her the chains of unseen affliction, to bear the whispers of torment that bent the soul beneath their weight. But her story reminds us that even the deepest fractures yield beneath redemption, that chaos is not the final chapter. So too, within the ancient stories of giants, beneath the unsettling images of fallen angels and towering beings, there lies the quiet thread of restoration, of a world reshaped by the flood, of hope rising from the waters. The Book of Enoch, though not preserved within the sacred canon, lingers on the edges of faith and curiosity alike, its verses stirring both wonder and caution. It is a glimpse, not necessarily of confirmed truth, but of the questions that have always walked beside the human heart. Who were the Nephilim? How vast were their shadows? How far did their influence stretch across the soil of the early world? The scriptures leave space for mystery. They do not fully unveil the giants, nor do they erase their presence entirely. Their story becomes a sacred pause within the greater narrative, a quiet reminder that not all is explained, that some shadows serve to humble, to caution, to stir reflection. Across time, Their presence resurfaces upon battlefields, in the legends of distant lands, in the ruins scattered across forgotten hills. The Nephilim, the mighty ones of old, the giants whose footsteps stretch beyond what history dares to preserve. But always, their presence folds beneath the greater story, a story not of giants alone, but of faith rising against fear, of love silencing the shadows, of a creator whose hand shapes the course of history beyond even the tallest of adversaries. Mary had stood beneath her own giants, the torment that once devoured her mind, the chains that clung like fog. But freedom broke through, not by her might, but by the quiet, unwavering hand of the healer. So too, the giants of scripture, of myth, of whispered legend, stand not as the final word, but as echoes within the greater song of redemption. The Nephilim, the Watchers, the giants whose shadows stretch long upon the earth. Their story invites us to wonder, to question, to walk carefully among the ancient pages of scripture and beyond. And as we wander deeper still, we follow their echoes, not to glorify fear, but to understand the vastness of the story, the quiet hum of mystery that beckons us beyond what we see, toward the unfolding of a truth larger than giants, and older than time itself. The ancient world never fully forgets, even as kingdoms fall, as languages fade, as the stones of forgotten cities crumble beneath the weight of time. Certain stories endure, woven into the fabric of human memory like faint, stubborn threads that refuse to fray entirely. The Nephilim, the giants whispered of in scripture, the mighty ones of old, their echoes drift beyond the hills of Canaan, beyond the ruins of Bashan, beyond even the apocryphal scrolls hidden away in caves and deserts. Their shadows stretch into cultures distant from the biblical world, carried in the oral traditions, myths, and cautionary tales of peoples scattered across the earth. In the Americas, ancient mounds rise from the soil, earthworks layered with both mystery and sacred reverence. Among the tribes, stories of great beings, giants who once roamed the forests and plains, linger quietly, their presence half remembered, their downfall woven into the changing landscape. In the high deserts of North Africa, among the forgotten ruins pressed beneath Sahara sands, tales surface of tall figures with strength beyond ordinary men, their presence unsettling, their legacy buried beneath layers of both history and speculation. Across the Pacific, upon the island cliffs, statues stand tall, faces carved with solemn precision, their size stirring questions older than written history. Are these merely the relics of human imagination, the exaggerated footprints of ancient builders, their ingenuity mistaken for something more? Or do they hint at a forgotten presence, a quiet, unsettling reminder that giants, in some form, may have once pressed their heels into the earth across distant lands? The scriptures are deliberate in their silence beyond the borders of Israel, beyond the immediate narrative of covenant and kingdom. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, their story remains tethered to the sacred soil of the Promised Land, their echoes loudest where the unfolding of redemption meets the opposition of towering shadows. Yet the human heart reaches beyond boundaries, stitching fragments of story across oceans and mountains, tracing the faint hum of giants wherever it is found. Mary of Magdala had known the boundaries of her world, the expectations placed upon her, the chains of affliction wrapped tight, the walls that once seemed unyielding. But love, when it comes, does not bow to borders. It stretches wide, it unravels what binds, it presses beyond the limitations of what was once believed possible. So too, the story of giants stretches, faint and fragmented, but persistent. Across stone and soil, across myth and scripture, across the places where history fades into legend, the question remains: the giants, were they only of Canaan? Or did their shadows wander farther, the bones unearthed, the megaliths that rise, the whispers passed from elder to child? Each fragment stirs the ancient longing to understand, to piece together the puzzle of human beginnings, to reconcile the grandeur of creation with the unsettling presence of beings greater than ourselves. Some say the giants live only in myth now, their presence exaggerated by fearful hearts, their stories twisted through the lens of legend. Others peer into the ancient texts, into the sacred silence that surrounds the Nephilim, and wonder what remains hidden. The giants of Scripture stood tall, but their story was never meant to endure untouched. One by one, they fell, their presence unraveled by faith, their defiance silenced beneath the steady hand of heaven. Yet even as their bodies returned to the earth, their names lingered, carried across time, tangled in both reverence and caution. Mary's chains once seemed permanent, her suffering towering beyond hope. But even giants fall when met with love fierce enough to silence the storm. The Nephilim, the giants, the mighty ones of old, they rise and fall within the sacred narrative, their presence shaping the edges of the human story, their legacy folded into the soil of forgotten hills. But the greater truth hums quietly beneath their towering forms, the truth that no shadow, however vast, stretches beyond the reach of the divine. And so, we follow their echoes further still, wandering beyond borders, beyond myth, beyond the quiet ruins where giants may have walked, and where mystery still lingers. The shadows of giants stretch not only across the hills and ruins of the earth, but through the language we speak, through the metaphors we carry, through the quiet spaces where human memory and sacred mystery entwine. Even now, the word giant hums beneath the surface of our stories. Legends of strength, of defiance, of beings larger than life itself. The Nephilim of Genesis, the Rephaim of Canaan, the Anakim of Hebron. These ancient names ripple outward, their meanings layered with awe and caution alike. Yet their story does not exist solely in stone or soil. It lingers in the questions that press gently upon the human heart, the questions of origin, of purpose, of the boundaries between heaven and earth. Mary of Magdala had once lived tangled in questions, the ache of affliction, the burden of misunderstanding, the chains of unseen torment. But the healer's hand unraveled those questions, not with immediate answers, but with presence, with love, with the quiet authority that dissolves fear. So too, the giants of Scripture, for all their stature and might, stand not as the conclusion of the story, but as signposts, markers along the fragile path of understanding that winds through the ancient world. In Genesis, their mention precedes the flood, the great unraveling of human corruption, the silencing of violence, the cleansing of creation beneath waters vast and unrelenting. The Nephilim, their presence unsettling, their origins debated, mark the threshold between innocence lost and redemption sought. After the flood, their echoes remain, the Anakim upon the hills, the Rephaim whispering through the plains of Bashan, the towering figures who dared to defy the people of God, only to fall beneath the weight of divine promise. Yet beneath the physical presence of giants, a deeper truth hums. They stand as more than beings of flesh and bone. They become metaphors for the towering fears that loom across every generation, the shadows of oppression, the weight of the unknown, the obstacles that stretch tall upon the horizon of human longing. David stood beneath Goliath, not merely as a boy facing a warrior, but as a fragile soul confronting the towering lie that strength alone commands victory. His sling, his stone, his faith, the tools of one anchored not in might, but in quiet trust, fractured the myth of invincibility that giants so often wear. The giants we face, like those of Scripture, may not always rise in the form of towering beings, but they press upon us still, in grief, in doubt, in injustice, in the ache of unanswered questions. Mary carried those giants within her, the storm of affliction, the weight of rejection, the chains of misunderstanding. Yet her story, like David's, reminds us that giants fall, not always with thunderous collapse, but with the steady unraveling of fear beneath the presence of divine love. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the ancient mighty ones, they stir curiosity, they invite wonder, they fuel questions that stretch beyond history into the sacred unknown. But their presence also humbles us, reminding each generation that strength is fleeting, that size and might unravel when confronted by the quiet, relentless authority of faith. Across the hills of Canaan, upon the battlefields of ancient Israel, through the ruins of forgotten lands, the story of giants lingers, not to magnify fear, but to stir courage, to awaken humility, to point toward a truth larger than size, older than shadow, deeper than myth. The Nephilim walked the early earth. The giants of Canaan defied the promises of heaven. The mighty ones fell, one by one, beneath the unfolding story of redemption. And still, their echoes hum beneath the stones, across the pages of Scripture, within the quiet spaces where human wonder meets divine mystery. As we follow their story further, we do not merely seek their footprints. We seek the greater light that rises beyond them, the truth that no giant, however vast, can withstand the hand of the one who weaves history from dust and stars alike. The story of giants weaves through Scripture like an ancient river, its source hidden, its path winding, its waters carrying both wonder and quiet unease. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, their names drift through the sacred text, their shadows rising at the edges of the biblical narrative, their presence unsettling yet undeniable. But beyond the giants themselves lies a deeper question, a hum beneath the soil of ancient lands, an ache within the human spirit reaching toward understanding. What do the giants reveal about us, about our fears, about the fragile place we occupy within creation? Mary of Magdala had walked that fragile place, the ache of affliction pressing heavy, the storm of the unknown battering her soul. Yet her story was not one of defeat. It was one of quiet defiance, of love unraveling chains, of a presence so vast that even the deepest shadows fractured in its wake. So too, the giants of Scripture do not stand as the final word upon the earth, but as reminders of human frailty, of the boundaries we cannot always see, of the forces that ripple beneath the visible world. In Genesis, the Nephilim arrive with little warning, the sons of God, the daughters of men, a union veiled in mystery, a legacy marked by giants walking among mortals. Their presence precedes the flood, a world unraveling beneath violence, beneath pride, beneath defiance against the sacred order etched into creation's bones. After the flood, they linger still, the Anakim upon the hills, their stature a quiet challenge to the promises whispered upon Sinai, their presence a test for the hearts of those called to trust beyond what eyes can measure. The giants fall, as they must, their names dissolving into the soil, their stories echoing only as fragments within the greater tapestry of Scripture. Yet their presence awakens something within us, a tension between awe and caution, between wonder and humility, between the desire to understand and the quiet admission that some mysteries remain. Across cultures, across oceans, across the ruins of forgotten civilizations, their shadows stretch, the whispers of giants among the Inca ruins, the statues carved upon remote islands, the earthworks rising upon the plains, the megalithic stones leaning into sky and time alike. Are these echoes of the Nephilim? Footprints of mighty ones whose presence defied history? Or are they the remnants of human longing, of myth layered upon the unknown, of stories pressed into the soil by hearts reaching beyond their fragile boundaries? The scriptures do not anchor the giants beyond the ancient hills of Israel. They confine the Nephilim to the early chapters, their story brief, their impact rippling but contained. Yet the human heart wanders, stitching together the threads of legend and faith, seeking understanding in the ruins and the stones, in the stories passed from generation to generation. Mary had wandered too, her life shaped by affliction, her understanding strained beneath the weight of unseen chains. But her wandering met the hand of the healer, the voice of the one who called her by name, the quiet authority that silenced the storm within. So too, the giants of Scripture remind us that size does not command the story. Their stature towers, their shadows loom, but their presence ultimately yields to faith, to courage, to the steady unfolding of a narrative greater than even the tallest of adversaries. The giants walk the hills of Canaan. They defy the armies of Israel. They rise upon battlefields, only to fall beneath the weight of obedience and trust. Their echoes drift beyond Scripture, into the myths of distant lands, into the ruins of ancient builders, into the questions that press gently upon our understanding of the past. But their shadows are not the final veil across history. Beyond them rises a greater light, the quiet truth that no giant, no fear, no shadow stretches beyond the reach of divine love. The Nephilim walk the earth. The mighty ones of old defied the unfolding of redemption. But love, fierce and steady, towers still, its presence unraveling every chain, silencing every storm, scattering every shadow. And as we followed the giants deeper still, we do so not to magnify their might, but to remember the greater story rising quietly beyond them. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of history. Empires rise and fall, languages fade like forgotten songs, and the stones of ancient cities crumble beneath the slow, steady rhythm of rain and wind. But stories endure. They move quietly beneath the surface of generations, passed from trembling lips to curious hearts, woven into the soil of distant lands, stitched into the bones of memory. The story of giants is no different. The Nephilim of Genesis, the mighty ones of old, the Anakim whose stature defied the courage of wandering tribes, their echoes have never truly left us. Even now, their presence hums beneath the surface of our imaginations, tangled in the myths of cultures scattered across the world, their legacy folded into the quiet spaces where scripture, history, and wonder collide. In the high places of South America, ruins press against the sky, vast stones carved with impossible precision, ancient walls fitted so tightly that not even a blade of grass can slip between them. Among the elders, stories drift, of tall beings who moved the stones with ease, of giants whose strength shaped the land before the people came. Across the Atlantic, upon the windswept moors of Ireland, legends speak of Fionn mac Cumhaill, a giant whose footsteps carved the causeway stretching across the sea, whose might defied both time and reason. In the deserts of North Africa, where forgotten tombs crumble beneath shifting sands, fragments of tales linger, of beings taller than men, their bones buried beneath dunes, their stories lost to all but whispered tradition. Even in the Pacific, upon distant islands etched with stone statues staring toward the horizon, questions remain. Were these the remnants of a mighty people? Were their builders touched by the same echoes that ripple from the ancient Nephilim? The scriptures do not chase these stories across oceans or continents. They anchor the giants to the hills of Canaan, to the battlefields of Israel, to the quiet warning that not all who walk tall endure. But the human heart wanders. We seek connections across the threads of mystery, across the faded pages of myth, across the sacred fragments that stretch beyond the boundaries of what we can measure. Mary of Magdala had once wandered too, her spirit tangled in questions, her mind shackled by torment, her days fractured by shadows unseen. But her story reminds us that even in wandering, the hand of heaven draws near, that love stitches together what was once broken, that peace presses gently against the edges of the unknown. So too, the story of giants invites us to wander, not in fear, but in reflection, in curiosity, in reverence for the vast, untamed story unfolding beyond what we see. The giants of Scripture stood tall, their presence unsettling, their might a challenge to faith. But they fell, not by strength greater than theirs, but by courage anchored in promise, by hearts that trusted beyond sight, by the steady, quiet authority of the Creator who bends history toward redemption. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the mighty ones of old, their names rise from the sacred text like distant thunder, their legacy lingering in both myth and cautionary tale. But their shadows do not stretch endlessly. They fade beneath the rising dawn of faith, beneath the gentle unraveling of fear, beneath the steady hand of the one who commands giants and grasshoppers alike. The ruins of ancient builders, the myths of distant peoples, the questions that ripple across forgotten stones and whispered traditions, they stir the same ancient longing, the desire to understand, to trace the footsteps of those who walked before, to reconcile the impossible with the sacred. But beyond every towering legend, beyond every whispered story of giants, the truth hums steady. Love rises taller still, and as we follow the echoes of the Nephilim further, we do so with both caution and wonder, remembering always that no shadow, however vast, eclipses the quiet, enduring hand of heaven. The earth turns and the seasons change, but the questions, they remain. Some pressed quietly beneath the soil, others drifting upon the lips of storytellers, whispered through generations like fragile threads carried upon the wind. The Nephilim, the giants of Scripture, the mighty ones of old. Their story hums softly in the background of human memory, stubborn, unsettling, refusing to fade entirely. Even now, as we walk among towering cities of glass and steel, as satellites drift silently across the night sky, as science charts the boundaries of the known, the ancient shadows still whisper, the faintest echo of giants lingering along the edges of understanding. Beneath museums and research centers, in the quiet corners of academic halls, old bones are studied, ancient relics catalogued, artifacts from civilizations whose stories are only half recovered, half understood, and in rare, often controversial spaces, tales surface once more, reports of oversized skeletons unearthed in forgotten caves, of bones too long, too vast, their existence debated, disputed, dismissed. Some say these are nothing but exaggerations. Human remains distorted by time, by erosion, by the eager imagination of those desperate for connection to the old legends. Others wonder, could they be fragments of the giants, remnants of the Nephilim, their presence veiled by dust and doubt, surfacing briefly before slipping once more into the shadows of forgotten fields? The scriptures remain steady, measured, offering only glimpses of the giants, never glorifying them, never lingering long upon their legacy. Their story serves not to exalt, but to humble, to caution, to remind each generation that even the greatest fall, that even the tallest adversaries unravel before the quiet hand of heaven. Mary of Magdala had carried giants within her, the towering affliction that once claimed her mind, the storm of shadows pressing heavy upon her soul. Yet her healer did not glorify the torment, did not linger upon the chains. He shattered them. He called her by name. He lifted her from the dust. And love, quiet and relentless, rose taller than every unseen adversary. So too, the Nephilim, whatever their origins, whatever their fate, stand as a shadowed echo, a faint warning upon the ancient landscape. Their presence unsettles, their downfall humbles, their legacy reminds us that might without righteousness fractures, that strength without faith collapses, that even the giants cannot withstand the steady unfolding of divine purpose. Across forgotten battlefields, upon the hills of Canaan, through the ruins pressed beneath shifting sands, their story lingers, but it does not define the sacred narrative. It hums at its edges, a reminder that the boundaries between seen and unseen, known and unknown, stretch wider than we often admit. The myths of distant lands, the ancient stones leaning against time, the whispered traditions of giants beyond scripture. They stir curiosity, they challenge complacency, they awaken the fragile wonder that reaches toward understanding. But beyond every question, beyond every shadow, beyond every towering legend, rises the quiet authority of love, the same love that stilled Mary's storm, the same love that steadied David's hand, the same love that bends history toward hope, that writes redemption upon the edges of mystery. The giants walked, their shadows stretched, but love towers still. And as we follow the story of the Nephilim further, we step gently, our hearts open, our wonder steady, our faith anchored beyond the tallest ruins, beyond the oldest questions, beyond even the shadows of giants themselves. The footsteps of giants fade, but their echoes press on, stitched into the corners of forgotten fields, tangled in the quiet spaces where faith and mystery intertwine. The Nephilim, the mighty ones of old, the giants whose shadows once stretched across the hills of Canaan. Their story hums like a distant storm, never fully explained, never entirely silenced. And yet, beyond the whispers of towering figures, beyond the fragments of scripture, there unfolds a greater, quieter truth. The truth that giants, no matter how vast, cannot command the story forever. Mary of Magdala had learned that truth intimately. Her life, once bent beneath unseen chains, had seemed unchangeable, her torment towering, her affliction relentless. But love had unraveled the impossible. The healer's hand had lifted her from the weight of shadows. His voice had fractured the chains wrapped tight around her spirit. His presence had silenced every storm. So too, the giants of scripture fall, not always with thunderous collapse, but with the steady unraveling of fear, with the quiet defiance of faith anchored deeper than what eyes can measure. David stood beneath Goliath, not with strength in hand, but with trust in heart, with stones smoothed from riverbeds, with courage steadied by the promises etched upon ancient hills. His sling turned faster than fear, his stone struck sharper than legend, and the giant crumpled, his defiance shattered beneath the hand of heaven. Across the hills of Hebron, Caleb pressed forward, his spirit unyielding, his faith older than the giants who guarded the land. The Anakim fell, their stronghold surrendered, their shadows fractured by obedience that dared to believe beyond what seemed possible. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the mighty ones who once defied the unfolding of history, they rise and fall within the sacred text, their names fading into soil and stone, their presence ultimately yielding to the quiet, relentless authority of the divine. But still, the questions linger. Were they mere men, their size exaggerated by time and awe? Or were they something more? Beings touched by mystery, by rebellion, by the fragile, unsettling boundaries between heaven and earth. The scriptures guard their silence, offering only glimpses, fragments, invitations to wonder rather than declarations of certainty. And the world, ancient and modern alike, stitches together the puzzle, tracing their echoes across ruins, across mythologies, across the forgotten stones pressed deep into distant landscapes. But perhaps the giants were never meant to be fully explained. Perhaps their presence serves a different purpose, a reminder that some shadows humble us, some mysteries steady our wonder, some questions stretch beyond what eyes can measure or minds can grasp. Mary's chains once seemed endless, her suffering vast, her affliction towering beyond reason. But she learned that the impossible falls before love. The giants we face, whether carved in ancient stone or pressing quietly upon the heart, stand not as monuments to fear, but as reminders of faith's quiet defiance, of love's relentless height, of redemption's steady unraveling of what once seemed unshakable. The Nephilim walk the earth, their shadows stretching across ancient fields. But love towers still, taller than giants, deeper than fear, older than even the whispers of mighty ones lost to time. And as we wander the story further, as we follow the faint footsteps of giants through scripture and beyond, we do so with reverence, with curiosity that humbles, with hearts anchored not in fear, but in the quiet, steady unfolding of a greater truth, a truth that rises taller than any shadow the earth has ever known. The ancient world held its breath beneath skies vast and unbroken, its hills heavy with stories, its valleys etched with forgotten footsteps. Among those stories, the giants walked, beings whose presence fractured the boundaries of ordinary life, whose size and might stirred awe, caution, and quiet fear. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the mighty ones of old. Their shadows stretched across the earliest chapters of Scripture, their names whispered through generations, their presence woven into the fabric of both myth and faith alike. But their story was never meant to stand alone. The giants arrive within the sacred text, not as the centerpiece, but as the backdrop, a quiet, unsettling hum against the greater unfolding of redemption. Mary of Magdala understood the backdrop of shadows. Her life, once consumed by unseen affliction, had been marked by whispers, by the weight of torment others could not see. But even in her suffering, the story was never fully hers to carry alone. The healer stepped into her shadows, his love fracturing the chains that bound her, his presence rewriting her future with the quiet authority of one whose compassion towers beyond fear. So too, the story of giants fades beneath the greater narrative of Scripture. They rise, they defy, they fall. Their presence unsettles, but their legacy yields to faith, to redemption, to the relentless unfolding of love that silences even the tallest shadows. The Nephilim, born of mystery, tangled in the brief verses of Genesis, their origins veiled, their presence fleeting, their downfall inevitable. The Rephaim and Anakim, their stature vast, their defiance loud, their names etched into the battlefields of Israel, but their strength fractures beneath the steady march of faith. David's stone, Caleb's courage, Joshua's obedience. The giants fall, one by one, their might unraveling beneath the quiet, sacred authority of the divine. Beyond the borders of Israel, the whispers continue. Tales of towering beings carried across continents, myths stitched into distant cultures, ruins pressed deep into forgotten lands. Their echoes stir wonder, but they do not define the story. The giants hum at the edges of history, reminders of pride, of rebellion, of human frailty reaching too far. But the heart of Scripture beats steady beyond them, a rhythm of love, of redemption, of a creator whose hand bends even the tallest adversaries toward his purpose. Mary's journey mirrors that rhythm, her giants unseen, her suffering vast, her fear once towering. But love rises taller still. Her healer calls her by name, her chains fracture, her story reshaped not by shadow, but by light. The giants we face, whether carved in ancient stone, pressed beneath layers of history, or lingering quietly within our hearts, cannot endure where love stands. Their shadows stretch, but they are not endless. Their size intimidates, but it does not define the outcome. Across time, across Scripture, across the quiet corners of human longing, the giants fall. What remains is the greater story, the story of redemption that towers beyond myth, beyond fear, beyond even the tallest whispers of those mighty ones of old. And as we follow the echoes of the Nephilim deeper still, we walk not to glorify their presence, but to remember the truth that shadows break, that giants fall, that love stands, unwavering, ancient, eternal. The earth holds its quiet secrets, tucked beneath layers of stone and soil, hidden in the folds of forgotten hills, whispered through ancient winds that curl along the edges of distant lands. The giants of Scripture, the Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, are woven into those whispers, their presence lingering not in monuments alone, but in the unsettled corners of the human spirit, where wonder aches to understand, where mystery hums just beyond reach. Across the hills of Canaan, their shadows once stretched long, their figures vast, their strength unmatched, their defiance etched into the memory of those who walked the ancient soil. The spies sent by Moses recoiled before them, their courage frayed by the sheer height of the beings who stood between them and the promises spoken by God. Yet the giants, for all their size, did not endure. Their strongholds fractured beneath faith, their defiance silenced by courage, rooted in trust, their legacy diminished, their names faded into stone and soil. But even as their presence unraveled, their story drifted outward, beyond Israel, beyond the pages of sacred text, into the myths and traditions of peoples scattered across the world. Their echoes ripple through distant legends, of titans who battled gods, of beings vast and proud, whose strength faltered before the weight of fate, of fallen watchers, of rebellious lines whose legacy blurred into both history and warning. In the apocryphal writings, the Book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nephilim return, their presence expanded, their origins explored, their downfall pressed further into the cautionary layers of ancient tradition. The Watchers, the sons of God, the daughters of men, beings who trespassed upon boundaries set by the divine, whose union birthed giants that consumed the earth, whose defiance sparked a cleansing flood, meant to unravel what had gone so terribly wrong. Mary of Magdala had once stood beneath the weight of unseen trespass, her soul shackled by torment, her mind fragmented by suffering, her life pressed beneath chains few could see. But love does not yield to shadows. Her healer shattered the boundaries of fear, stepped into the fracture of her affliction, called her by name, and lifted her from despair into the quiet, enduring dawn of peace. So too, the giants of old, for all their stature, for all their unsettling might, faltered when confronted by the steady unfolding of divine authority. The Nephilim, mighty in legend, fractured by the flood. The Rephaim, vast in reputation, silenced by faith. The Anakim, towering upon the hills, scattered by obedience. Their presence humbles, their story warns, their legacy unsettles. But beyond their rise and fall stretches the greater truth, that no shadow, no strength, no rebellion towers beyond the reach of the Creator, who bends even the tallest of adversaries toward his purpose. Across time, the giants linger, not as rulers, but as echoes, their story buried beneath layers of soil and myth, their presence folded into the quiet reminder that pride fractures, that defiance collapses, that even the impossible yields to love. Mary's giants had once seemed endless, but love proved taller still. The Nephilim stood vast upon the ancient earth, but faith, steady and unwavering, stands taller yet. As we wander the story further, as we follow the faint, stubborn whispers of giants through scripture, through tradition, through the ruins of forgotten places, we carry this quiet truth, that the tallest shadows fall, that mystery humbles us, that love rises, steady, unbroken, eternal, beyond every whispered legend of giants lost to time. The stones of the earth remember, even when the tongues of men fall silent. Beneath the soil, beneath the shifting sands of forgotten kingdoms, beneath the roots of ancient trees that have stretched toward the heavens for countless generations, the story of giants hums, a quiet, persistent thread stitched into the land itself. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the mighty ones of old, their shadows have faded, their bones returned to dust, their legends softened by time. And yet, their echoes linger, woven through scripture, tangled in myth, pressed into the cautious wonder that stirs whenever we trace the unknown edges of history. Across distant hills and valleys, remnants of ancient peoples remain, their structures vast, their knowledge unsettling, their presence whispering of hands that shaped the earth before the stories we know took root. Some say these were the giants, the towering beings of scripture, the children of rebellion, the mighty ones whose downfall was inevitable, whose legacy now lingers only as fragments buried beneath the bones of the world. Others dismiss these whispers, myths born from misunderstanding, exaggerations fueled by awe, tales stretched across generations by the fragile, relentless longing to explain what cannot yet be measured. But beyond debate, beyond certainty, beyond even the boundaries of sacred text, the giants stand as reminders of human frailty, of pride untethered, of the tension that hums quietly between what is seen and what is left to faith. Mary of Magdala had known that tension, the ache of unanswered questions, the burden of chains wrapped tight around her soul, the storm of shadows pressing against the fragile walls of understanding. But her story did not end with mystery alone. Her healer came, not with immediate explanation, but with presence, with love, with the quiet authority that steadied her spirit and fractured the impossible weight of affliction. So too, the giants of Scripture do not stand as the conclusion of the sacred story. They arrive, they defy, they fall. Their presence unsettles, their echoes stir wonder, but their legacy yields to the unfolding of redemption, to the gentle, relentless hand of a creator whose authority stretches beyond shadow, beyond strength, beyond every towering myth. Across the ancient hills upon forgotten battlefields, through the scattered ruins of distant civilizations, the giants hum, not as rulers, but as echoes of what once challenged faith, what once tested courage, what once pressed against the fragile edges of obedience. But love rises taller still. The giants fall before stones slung by shepherds, before faith declared by the bold, before the quiet, unwavering march of a story etched in both dust and eternity. The Nephilim walked, the Rephaim challenged, the Anakim defied, but in the end, it is not their might we remember most. It is their humbling. It is the reminder that strength apart from righteousness fractures, that defiance yields to obedience, that no adversary towers beyond the reach of divine love. Mary's chains once seemed impossible, but they shattered beneath compassion, fierce enough to silence the storm. The giants of Scripture, vast in stature, proud in presence, met their end beneath the quiet authority of a faith that never bows to fear. As we follow their story toward its closing echoes, as we trace the faint, unsettled whispers of giants through Scripture and across forgotten soil, we walk not to glorify their legend, but to remember the deeper truth, the truth that shadows stretch. But love stretches farther still. The story of giants fades quietly now, like the last traces of mist dissolving beneath the morning sun. Their presence, vast and unsettling, once stretched across ancient hills. Their footsteps pressed deep into the soil of a world still young, still raw with wonder and defiance. But like all shadows, they have receded. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the mighty ones of old. Their names echo across time, not in triumph, but in caution, in humility, in the quiet reminder that even the tallest fall, even the fiercest yield beneath the steady unfolding of a story greater than strength alone. Scripture remembers them not to glorify their might, but to frame their downfall, to tether their rise to the fragile nature of pride, to the fleeting nature of human rebellion against the hand that shaped the stars and the soil alike. Mary of Magdala had lived beneath towering shadows of her own, her mind fractured, her spirit shackled, her days consumed by chains few could see. But love unraveled those giants. The healer called her by name. His presence shattered what once seemed impossible. Her story did not end in fear, but in freedom. A quiet, steady reminder that no shadow, however vast, commands the final word. The giants of Scripture fall one by one, their names blurred by time, their strength forgotten beneath the gentle rise of faith, of obedience, of trust anchored beyond what eyes can measure. Across the hills of Hebron, their strongholds collapse. Upon the valley floors of Israel, their defiance shatters beneath stones smooth from riverbeds. Even upon distant ruins pressed into forgotten lands, their echoes linger only as faint, stubborn questions, as reminders that strength, apart from purpose, fractures beneath the weight of time. Yet still, the world remembers, across cultures, across myths, across ancient stones and whispered traditions, the giants remain, not as rulers, but as echoes, as invitations to wonder, as fragments of the tension that hums between the seen and the unseen. The Nephilim, tangled in the early verses of Genesis, their origins veiled, their story fleeting, their presence unsettling. The Rephaim, whose name stirs even in the shadows of prophecy. The Anakim, whose sighs once silenced the courage of wandering tribes. They rise, they defy, they fall. And in their unraveling, the greater truth emerges. A truth not anchored in might, but in mercy, not declared through shadow, but through the steady unfolding of divine love. Mary's journey is proof of that truth. The giants within her fell not by her strength, but by the quiet authority of the one who stooped low enough to heal, whose love stretched taller than fear, whose compassion silenced every storm. So too, the giants of history, of scripture, of myth, their story yields to a greater hand, to a love vast enough to bend the course of time, to a creator whose reach eclipses even the tallest defiance. As we prepare to step beyond their echoes, to let the last whispers of giants settle into the soil of memory, we carry with us not fear, but reverence, the humble, sacred understanding that though the shadows stretch long, love stretches farther still. And so we follow their story to its quiet close, remembering always that beyond every towering presence, the hand of heaven endures. The story of giants ends, as all things must, not with the thunder of their footsteps, nor with the clash of swords upon ancient fields, but with silence. A silence that hums beneath the soil, beneath the crumbled walls of forgotten cities, beneath the hills where shadows once stretched long and proud. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the mighty ones of old, their names drift softly now, woven through scripture like the faintest echoes of a distant storm. Their presence, vast and unsettling, shape the edges of sacred history, but they do not command its center. Their shadows challenged, their strength defied, but love rose taller still. Mary of Magdala carried her own shadows, the towering weight of affliction, the chains of unseen torment, the storm that fractured her spirit. But even her giants fell, not by might, but by mercy, not by strength, but by the quiet authority of compassion fierce enough to silence fear. Her healer stepped into her darkness, his love steady, his presence unshaken, his hand reaching beyond what seemed possible, calling her by name, lifting her from the depths of what once held her captive. So too, the giants of the earth, proud, defiant, vast in reputation, fell before the unfolding of a greater story. Across the hills of Hebron, upon the valley floors of Israel, upon distant ruins etched with forgotten legends, their echoes fade. They were never meant to endure. They stood, they defied, they collapsed. Reminders not of strength, but of frailty, of the impermanence of pride, of the quiet unraveling of shadows when confronted by truth. The Nephilim arrived in the earliest chapters of Genesis, their origins veiled, their presence fleeting, their downfall inevitable. The Rephaim and Anakim rose, but their legacy dissolved into soil and stone. Even Goliath, fierce upon the battlefield, towering above trembling soldiers, fell beneath the hand of a shepherd whose sling carried more than stones. It carried the quiet defiance of faith. And beyond them all, love endured. The Creator who shaped the stars and the soil, the valleys and the mighty ones alike, stands unmoved by size, unshaken by rebellion, unhindered by shadows. The giants fell, as they must. Their presence stirred awe, their downfall stirred reflection. Their echoes linger only as whispers along the edges of history, a hum beneath forgotten ruins, a question beneath distant myths, a caution etched gently into the bones of the earth. But love remains. It stretches beyond every towering legend. It silences every storm. It bends even the tallest adversaries toward its quiet, relentless purpose. Mary's chains shattered, her shadows dissolved. Her story, like the giants, was never meant to end in fear. It was always meant to end in love. The giants are gone, their names softened by time, their stature irrelevant beneath the steady unfolding of grace. And as we step beyond their story, as we let their final echoes settle into the quiet soil of memory, we carry this truth, that no shadow, no strength, no ancient myth rises taller than the love that still commands the earth. Love rises. Love stands. Love endures. Beyond giants, beyond fear, beyond even the edges of the oldest story the earth has ever known.